Hello, everyone. My name is Allie Wilbur, and I'm Curator of Public Programs at the Museum of Wisconsin Art. This year, we're celebrating MOA's 60th anniversary, and if that wasn't already enough to celebrate, we were given a transformational gift of Dr. James and Karen Hyde's Wisconsin Glass Collection, right on the cusp of the International Year of Glass 2022. We are proudly displaying this collection in our galleries through January 23rd, so you still have plenty of time to visit. I encourage you to bring your family members to MOA over the holiday season to see it. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with two incredible artists reflected in MOA's glass collection, Beth Lipman and John Clark. If you've been attending any of our artist talks at MOA or know a little bit about the history of Wisconsin glass, or if you get your hands on one of our exhibition catalogs, which is due to be in the gift shop any day now, just a little plug, something that comes up over and over again is our state's creative history with glass, as well as the international history of glass is UW-Madison and UW-River Falls. This is a reoccurring theme that we hear over and over again. John Clark, joining us today from just outside of Philadelphia, got his undergraduate degree from UW-River Falls, interacting with some reoccurring artists in the history of Wisconsin glass, such as Harvey Littleton. He later founded the Tyler School of Art's glass program, where he met Beth Lipman as a student. Beth Lipman didn't start out in Wisconsin, but we lured her here. She came to Wisconsin as an artist in residence at the John Michael Kohler Artist Residency Program and continues to be an international creative delight from Sheboygan, Wisconsin. So, warm welcome to both of them. I would just like to start by hearing from the both of you how you know each other.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here tonight with all of you, and especially Beth. I had the pleasure of working with Beth, being her teacher back in the early 90s. And she was at Tyler for around 4 years. And we got to know each other through her student work and her research. It was a pleasure. And I still recall her exhibition at Tyler. It was one of the first installations ever done by one of my students. So we have a long history. We've been in touch ever since.
Thank you so much, Allie. And I'm just like tickled to be here with you, John Clark. You've been a major influence on my work, on my practice, and on my life since I've met you. And I can also say that I find it fascinating to kind of rediscover how much of an influence you've been when we talk now. And I hear things that you say that I've actually internalized into my practice or just the way that I think about life. And then I realize, oh, that's why I think like that, is because you had such a strong vision that you shared with me and the other students and artists at Tyler. And I think it's hard to know at the time how, what goes in and what remains. And so it's a bit of a homecoming every time we get together and talk, because it just reaffirms, what a strong teacher you were for me.
Thank you, Beth. It's really wonderful to hear. I appreciate that. Allie asked us to actually talk a little bit about our history, and then we'll go into showing some of our work. I'm a Wisconsin boy. I grew up in a small town called Waterloo. It was very important in my creative life. I had one of my first mentors was my art teacher from Waterloo High School and grade school, and she was actually my kindergarten teacher. It's a small town, but throughout all of my experiences, she was the one that I remember. I worked with her in high school. She taught me how to see. She taught me how to slow down and really take a look at things. I hear her voice often. She also was one of the first people, I believe, that believed in me. And that was important for my self-confidence. And my second wonderful creative experience happened at the University of Wisconsin, River Falls. I left high school, not really sure what I was going to do with my life. I went into education and art at River Falls, and I was lucky to have found such a dynamic art department there. I really had wonderful role models in all the areas of study. I first studied printmaking, and Mary Barrett was a great teacher. All of these teachers I recall very clearly, and it was almost like going from a small town art program to this university program. I wanted to be a printmaking major as soon as I took printmaking. Then I was in metals, and I loved building things with precious materials. And painting and sculpture were really important. But once I went into ceramics and then glass, my life changed. And I had faculty members there who were role models that were living a lifestyle of working with their materials as a life experience. And I never even realized that this existed until I went to college. And so Doug Johnson, who started the glass program at River Falls, was a real glass medicine man. He showed me the magic of the material. He built everything from scratch, and he showed us all how to do that. So that empowered us to realize that we could actually become artists if we chose to do that. And that's a very courageous moment, I think, to enter into the idea of being a creative individual. But these people showed us the path to that by their living examples. Another very important person I met at River Falls was Dr. Robert Bailey. He was a sociologist who developed a program of research in Europe, and we could spend a semester abroad doing a research project. And taking advanced sociology, we were shown how to prepare, how to develop a thesis, and how to find ways of incorporating important places in Europe or institutions that would help us in our research. So in 1969, there were actually 3 of us glass students who went to Europe to study in different countries. McMillan was in Germany. Jim Ingebretson, who headed the glass program at River Falls for years, was up in Sweden. And I went to England to the Royal College of Art. But my research also took me to Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, where I worked with Mick a bit, and then down to Italy before I went to England as a special student at the Royal College of Art. So that was a life-changing moment. Doc Bailey was the guy that showed me to dream beyond our horizons. I was a small-town boy from Wisconsin, now living in Europe. And I actually decided to go back to graduate school. And I studied in England and spent about 3 years there working on the research. And when I was an undergrad at River Falls, I thought, man, this is quite the lifestyle these faculty have. And I thought, this is what I would love to do. I would love to develop a curriculum, and something that hadn't been developed yet in America for glass studies. And so one of my objectives in going to England was to really learn about technology, art history, design, have the ability to go to museums throughout Europe to see the history of glass through various cultures. And that was really eye-opening to me to have that opportunity. And so things happened after I graduated. I went to California for a bit to work with Marvin Lepofsky. And then I started the glass program at Tyler School of Art in 1973. So that's a bit of my history about how I got to Tyler, how I got to meet incredible people like Beth, of who there were very few, but certainly there were a number. In my creative work, I just want to sort of outline a little bit before we get into some of the images. I worked with glass about 40, 45 years. My first group of pieces were really more about the material. The next group of work had to do more with the figure and heroic figures. I went on to do other adventures, as I call them, in creative work. One thing I found through my experience of working that long was if you choose an adventure or an idea or a concept to start, it's really very exciting in the beginning because you don't know that much about it. But as you stay with it, you really get to know the nuances of it. And it, in some ways, for me, became a little bit automatic. I got really good at doing those adventures. And the series, I would then say, I need another change. I need another adventure. So I would either through a sabbatical by doing research in various new locations, I would start another group of work. So over those 40 years, I've had about 7 of those adventures. And now I'll share a few of those with you if we can look at a few slides. So this is some work from the late 60s and early 70s where I was working with hot glass. I was doing everything off of a blowpipe. I was very impressed with glass and its dynamic form-making potential. Everything I did usually had to do with gravity, centrifugal force, and inertia, using those forces on this molten material. And so when I would develop compositions, I really wanted to talk about movement and elevation, getting glass up off of a surface. This is another series I did while I was at the Royal College in London in 1969, where I was painting glass. And most people thought it was pretty radical to paint this beautiful material, but I thought it helped to identify the form better, and I also added elastic elements. So this is the time when I was making movers and cruisers. So let's see the next slide. This is a piece that was constructed out of many pieces of glass. It's painted, it has polyester material on it. I was really trying to get glass moving through space, not just a static object, but something that had a dynamic quality to it. So this is about 5 feet long, made up of about 9 different pieces of glass, and done in the late 60s, early 70s. And I think there's another slide coming up. These are a couple of other cruisers. Really, I think their form suggests motion. And the way I worked during this period was I would go to the studio and make a number of pieces based on drawings. And then I would come back and assemble them with adhesives. And I would paint them, and I would sandblast surfaces, and I would sand surfaces, and I would polish edges, trying to make a sweet composition of something that had a stance, had a movement, and it also expressed the qualities of glass, which was this dynamic movement in it. So those were some early things I did, mainly as a reaction to material and trying to develop sculptural compositions. After, I think this piece was done probably mid-70s, these 2 pieces, and I was then starting to do research in art history for teaching at Tyler, and I spent a lot of time looking at vessels. So if we could look at the next slide. I had seen these little objects at museums throughout the world called coal vessels. They're little mascara jars from maybe the 8th century BC. And they would have been used in the Egyptian culture primarily. The Greeks did do some later on around the 3rd century. But when I saw these little coal vessels, K-O-H-L, they appeared to me to have proportions of the human figure. And that compelled me to consider making a life-size vessel. So this piece is about 5 feet tall. It was blown into a steel mold. It has a foot, a shoulder, neck, and a lip. And those are all classic proportions of vessel making. Even though I'm not really a vessel maker, I like the idea of looking at the human proportions of most vessels that were designed and made for decorative or functional use. So let's see what the next slide is. Working with molds, I then wanted to get actually more figurative. And so I started to work on a personal heroic series. These pieces are about 25 inches tall. They were blown into molds. They're made with, the one on the left is actually combined with ceramics, and it's a combination of ceramics, glass, steel, and it resides on an alabaster base. The idea of this piece was a heroic figure moving through a threshold from one adventure to another. The other one is a warrior who resides on his lance after his adventure, his battle. So these were actually a response to some of the readings I had done about various cultures and sociologists who speak about finding one's bliss through an adventure. Okay, we can go to the next slide. This is a piece that is actually at the museum now. It's called The Priest. And this piece was done from a drawing I did while I was on sabbatical in Florence, where I was looking at Renaissance sculpture, primarily religious symbols of figures. And this was a piece about how religion and the priest has the power to prevail over many societies. Next slide, please. And then this is rounding out that series of figures done after a couple of other experiences through travel. These are both seated figures, and one is more abstract than the other, but here I'm working again with pure formal composition, and some of the surfaces have been modified. The piece on the right has been etched with hydrofluoric acid to give it that mysterious surface. This was actually done after a trip to Machu Picchu in Peru, looking at some of the stelae that were there. The piece on the left is a bit more organic. That was sort of a transition piece from some of the organic into the more formal. So you're getting a sense of some of the work that I've done with the figure. I had about 2 or 3 more adventures after the figure, but we're going to end up with my installation pieces that were based on natural phenomena. I was invited to do an installation at a museum, and at the time I was working with a number of previous graduate students. Angus Powers and I had been talking about collaborating on a piece, and we came up with an idea to make 5,000 of these split bifurcated natural forms to create kind of a landscape. And I call this my field of dreams, because it really sets up a moment where you can go beyond your reality into something that takes you deep into nature. In fact, the idea of this came to me during a camping trip where I just woke in the morning, I opened up the flaps of the tent, and I looked out into the meadow to see this glistening landscape of dew and plant life. So the next slide shows a formal installation at the Delaware Center of Contemporary Art in Wilmington, Delaware. This is in a room that's about 40 by 50. You're looking at a landscape of those 5,000 objects. We installed a 25-foot tree that is about 3 foot in diameter to give it a sense of scale and nature. And the gray screen that you see holds a projection of natural phenomena that goes on, and this is in a continuous loop. So this one was called Quantum. And a couple of years later, we can go to the next slide, I was asked to do an installation at the Philadelphia Art Alliance. And this piece is called Gravity. And I've made a 2-minute video illustrating this piece, and it's on YouTube, John Clark Studios Gravity. But this is a still, and it really is talking about centrifugal force, which is illustrated by that giant weather balloon that rotates in the center. There is a dynamic light show that's going on to the right. And this piece was reinstalled at the Bergstrom Mahler Museum back in 2018. And that's where this piece resides now as in their permanent collection. Thank you.
John, the piece before this one with like the sea of glass, yeah. How big are those five?
They range from about 8 to 14 inches tall.
Okay.
And they're all springing up from the floor of the museum.
It's magnificent. Thank you, Beth. Can we hear a little bit from you about your work and why you do it?
Sure. That was really wonderful, John. Thank you. And I have a lot of questions, but maybe we'll get into that later. I guess I should also start with some of my history, which I don't normally talk about in lectures. But I was born in Philadelphia, and my parents moved around a bunch, but my father's from Lancaster and my mother's from Brooklyn, and I grew up primarily in York and Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And I came from a strong lineage of creative women in my family. My mother was an artist and a craftsperson. She did craft fairs in the 80s, and I became her right-hand craft child, doing all of those fairs, both retail and wholesale. And my grandmother, her mother, was an excellent, she called herself a sewing or an embroidery technician, but her work was really remarkable. So, John, when you were talking about having mentors that really recognized you and gave you permission, maybe not directly, but indirectly, to pursue whatever your dreams might be in terms of a creative life or a life filled with creative practice. I would say that the women in my family led by example in that way. It was never questioned whether or not, I should pursue being an artist if I wanted to be an artist, because of course I could do that because they were doing that. So I just wanted to respond to that, John, a little bit, that it does. I mean, that's a massive, massive thing to have that recognition and also that acceptance and have it not questioned. And I think that I've met a lot of people in, my adult life who did not pursue a creative practice because they did not have that. They did at some point in their life, they were told no, or it's not possible. So anyway, we'll get into the work. And I also just want to start by saying that I'm sitting on the grounds of the traditional lands of the Potawatomi, the Chippewa, the Ottawa, Winnebago, and Menominee people, and I pay my respects to elders both past and present. That happens to be in Sheboygan Falls, Wisconsin, where I've been living since 2005. So I'm just going to talk briefly about my conceptual practice, and we're going to start with this image of scaling gazing ball, which you see here. My practice explores aspects of the human condition, material culture, and time through still lives, immersive installations, and photographs and video. The work is created primarily in glass and wood, but I also use a variety of materials, including metal, clay, sometimes found objects. The primary concerns are an investigation of temporality and mortality, which are also really very much a part of the still life tradition historically. And the work always juxtaposes different points of time in history with our current time to better understand the moment that we're living in now. It utilizes inanimate objects and domestic interiors to create portraits of individuals, institutions, and societies. And many times I now pair these inanimate object compositions with aspects of the natural world, which I'll talk about in a slide or two. At times, the work alludes to the corporal, which I have to say, John, I was thinking so much about in very specific slides that you showed us, especially some of the earlier slides, which I know is about movement, but is also so much about the body. And that I think is so inherent in the process and the material itself, that it's always, regardless of whether we think of ourselves as vessel makers, to your point, we're always starting with that premise of the vessel, which is also the metaphor for the body on some level, in my opinion. So you'll see here in Scaling Gazing Ball, there's some biomorphic forms that I do believe refer directly to the body, or in an interiority of the body. And this work was actually in process in the fall of 2019. So I think there's a little osmosis there with the beginnings of the pandemic at that time without my realizing it. Can I have the next slide? This is margin for error. I just would like to point out that furniture actually does play a large role in my installations and my compositions. It situates the work primarily in a domestic space. And in this particular case, this is in the Ringling Museum of Art's Astor Library. So it is very much about an interior, even though it's within a museum. But regardless, any time that there's a piece of furniture somewhere in the space, it automatically locates us in an interior, a domestic interior, and our relationship to it as a human. I also use period rooms, the idea of period rooms in my work frequently. And I'm also really interested, once again, in this anthropomorphic parallel that you find in furniture. So just as John was speaking about some of the parallels between the way to look at a vessel with the neck, the head, the shoulder, I'm investigating some of the semantics of furniture in a similar fashion, with feet, arms, backs, seats, and how that kind of implies the body. In this particular case, the viewer is really essential for completing this experience. So the viewer is kind of forced in this regard to walk past the crib which is located at the far left of the image. And then they're confronted with this adult cradle for rocking the moribund, which is from the Shaker tradition. So it really is a metaphor for birth and death and the kind of time that we traverse throughout that. Can I have the next slide? This is In Earth, which some of you may know. It is actually on view at the Museum of Wisconsin Art in the Carl von Marr Gallery. And it is situated kind of in front of and in dialogue with the flagellants, which is really kind of where it all began with MOA in a lot of ways. But I just want to say, I had said earlier that now you will find very direct references to the natural world within the work. And that was really inspired by really a deep concern about climate change, which kind of took hold in 2006 after I read a series of essays in The New Yorker by Elizabeth Kolbert called The Climate of Man. And at that time, actually, climate change was not really talked about very much, as some of you may remember, kind of in mass culture. Of course, the scientists were already deeply involved in talking about climate change, and some politicians, but for me, it was really an eye-opener, and I instantly realized that I needed to find a way to incorporate a vocabulary in my work that would recontextualize the composition in geological time or deep time, and try to address head-on the moment in time that we are living in, which is deeply vicarious or precarious, as we know. So now the table becomes porous. There are things that pierce through the table or cascade into and out of the table, and it becomes almost a timetable, and it starts to become stratigraphy. So it's starting to transition into something beyond the domestic, or in addition to the domestic. So in this case, in Earth, you'll find almost a paleo landscape that cascades over the surface of the table with all of these cultural detritus that are basically unfolding underneath the table. And the center, like probably the prioritized component of In Earth, which becomes a cycad over the table. A cycad is an example of an ancient plant, actually transitions into a Doric column underneath the table. So there's a lot of kind of slippage that's happening in this work. Okay, next. This is called Belongings, and I actually have two parallel practices that really deeply engage me in my creative practice. One is this kind of like maybe not so linear, but certainly focused trajectory of material culture investigation through still life, investigating of time with history. And then I have had the deep pleasure to have had the opportunity to respond directly to specific individuals' collections, specific institutions' collections, and histories. And this is one of the most recent kind of manifestations of that practice. It is a response work to the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art's portrait of Abigail Levy, who you see on the upper right-hand corner of the image. And the portrait is by Gerardus Duyckinck, somewhere around 1735. The sculpture is of a traveling trunk, obviously, and it investigates immigration, assimilation, and status or power, concepts that are rooted in the founding of the United States. And I will say that, for at least the last 10 years, a lot of the kind of research has been centered on what it means to be living in the United States today. It's become very, in some ways, hyper local as well. So it's kind of blown out in terms of like geological deep time and like the imprint of the human. And then it's become hyper focused on my kind of exact location. So the contents of this trunk really convey the identity of one woman, her family, and their respective trade, and the colonial society writ large at the time. So she and her family lived in New Amsterdam in the 17 and 1800s. She was from a merchant marine family by marriage, as well as her father was in the merchant was a merchant marine as well. And we know a lot about Abigail Levy Franks because she actually was a kind of a voracious writer. She wrote letters to her eldest son who went back to England. And so a lot of what we know about colonial America is through Abigail Levy Franks, simply because she wrote to her son as a mother. Okay, let's go on to House Album. So House Album, I see this piece really as almost a blending or a merging of both of these lines of practices that are happening simultaneously. So we're addressing some of the domestic concerns. It's also a very specific kind of response work. And I consider this piece a project that will most likely continue throughout my life. It's a selective portrait of the United States that explores issues surrounding agency, identity, and memory. It was inspired by the Victorian concept of house scrapbooking. And house scrapbooking was done by young women or mothers and children in Victorian America during a time where it was the first time where there was this deluge of printed material, primarily advertisements, that were landing on their doorsteps of their house. And in order to process and kind of play with all of this imagery, they started to collage their idealized version of what home was. And so I took this concept and I decided to kind of subvert it a little bit. And I started to amass and process all of the digital deluge of images that we have at this time and kind of selectively choose objects that represent individuals or events in the United States history that I considered important to what it means to be an American at this time. And the work will continue to change and evolve over time, depending upon where it's installed, where it's located. And just to say that it is laminated glass vinyl, it's hand sculpted glass, and there's also some metal in there. So this is really, this is my idealized understanding of a collective home in the United States. So I'm just going to leave it there because I think that we need to have time to talk about things now. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth.
Wow.
Well, I'll first say, anyone watching, if you have any questions for John or Beth, don't hesitate to throw those in the comments below right now. We will have a short Q&A section very soon. My first question, and I think it's a pretty obvious question, why glass, right? Out of all the materials, and perhaps there are other materials that you like to play with or work with or are inspired by, why glass primarily, and also what else?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. I think my work might be a little bit more glass-centric, but I was really reeling from the power of the material initially. But I realized once I got involved in it, it needed more.
Oh, we might have lost John.
We've frozen.
We'll give him a minute and see if he can hop back in. Beth, do
Okay,
you
if
want to
he
take a shot at
comes
that one?
back, if he comes back, I'll cede the floor to John. I think the power of the material to be a metaphor for life process, as well as its kind of allusion to the history of decorative arts. But really for me, it's the power inherent in the material, the fragility. He'll hop back on in a second, I think. The preciousness of the material, the transparency is very important. The fact that it can be both present and elusive at the same time. The kind of flaccidness, like the soft, and you really see that in John's work, that soft, the way he harnesses this like very body oriented material, but it's also quite hard. So it's like it has all of these really inherently like polarized qualities that I think can be really expressive and harnessed and used for different means to ends. That's what I would say. But I also have to say that I think that every material has these inherent qualities, and not necessarily the same qualities, but every material has inherent capacity to translate almost an energy and kind of expand on a concept through its inherent energy that's found in, we're all like just moving particles in the end, aren't we? Whatever our materials are. So we all have different ways of being in the world, and I think process and material certainly is no different than anything else in that way.
What other materials? So you mentioned working with some steel, vinyl. I think you mentioned something to me the other day about drawing. What are some other things besides glass that you like to work with? And is it related to glass, the way that you use it?
Well, I think, for me, like glass, all of the work is generated through drawing. So even though it's three-dimensional, it all comes from this understanding of creating space through line and form, volume, density. These are all kind of inherently things that are concerns with two-dimensional making as well. And I would be curious to hear what John has to say about that as well, because I know that he is an avid drawer as well. So I think there's a lot of like backstory behind our use of materials that, it's all, and also I was deeply influenced by my study of fibers. I had a fiber background at Tyler as well. And so that way of mending or binding or accumulating all comes into play in any material that I happen to be working with. That kind of way of understanding a way of composing is actually not always just about, many times it's not at all about glass. It's about other things.
Hi.
I was just filling in until you came back.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
I tell you, it's something. I love this technology. Yeah, I was just saying, glass was really so powerful in the initial period until I really started studying concepts that I wanted to employ with the material. So that then led me to so many new adventures in surface and form and adhesives and co-joining. Beth made a couple of comments about the human body always being present. There was some reason why this organic form maker was so compelling to me. And once I started working with it, I just couldn't stop. And today, drawing was so instrumental in my work. I had a big sign in my studio when I was in graduate school about daily drawing to help me move through more ideas more quickly, not just through thought, but through actually the physical making of forms and the context within which they resided. So glass was the power center to my work for years, but it's interesting how it really was a wonderful partner.
When Beth was talking about why she works with glass or how she works with glass, she mentioned textiles, and you use the word mending, and that kind of brings me to the thought of, well, also you mentioned fragility. Glass is a very fragile medium, and I feel like as a viewer looking at glass, part of a bit of the appeal is kind of its preciousness and its fragility. And as an artist working with glass, both of you, what is that process like? Do you have to not be terribly attached to something you're working on because it could be destroyed or broken at any moment's notice? Is that a concern you have? Is that something that is just so far behind you because so many things have been broken or didn't turn out the way that you thought they would? Just some thoughts on that process, I guess.
Beth, go ahead. I've got some thoughts.
Okay. I think that power never goes away. That inherent possibility of loss. I don't want to say failure because I don't actually judge that moment where things break as a failure, although I do know that that's actually maybe a part of a communal way of thinking about breaking. But for me, it's very much about like almost what is the narrative around that object and how does that relate to life and what I'm interested in conveying. And if something breaks, I see it as an opportunity to further a dialogue about what that relationship is with that object, how that object relates to the objects around it, what that's going to convey to the viewer. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's a facile way of really talking about impermanence and temporality and mortality. All of those things happen and are inherent in that act of breaking, and also like our inability to control, our belief that we are in control, and then these moments where there's some kind of accident or something that is outside of our control, and how do we negotiate those every time? Your turn, John.
Well, I think personality has a lot to do with how we get engaged the material, or any material for that matter. And loss is a big deal, initially when you experience losing a piece that you think is really wonderful. But over time, and there's a lot of life experiences you gain from working with glass. I made a lot of stuff. And I'm not sure why I did that. I think it was because I wanted to discover, but I also wanted there to be a big family of things that surrounded me that reminded me of uniqueness moments. It's like every moment we live in this life, there are unique things that happen to us. And I had the courage to go in and just play and discover and find. And through that, it empowered me to make new decisions. But Joseph Campbell often talked about the finding one's bliss. And my bliss was in the action of making and working with glass in many ways. But then I had another experience when I would go back to my studio and resolve the piece. So those are just some thoughts about the other thing is that a viewer, you view glass in a way that we as makers, I don't think, do. There's a romantic inclination about its fragility and all of the other things that appear to be, like we think of glass as very breakable. Well, it's actually really very resilient and can take tons of impact. It has great elasticity. So anyway, we are more brutal with it, I think, because we have a better understanding and we force it to do things many others wouldn't.
Yeah. When while you were away for a moment, Beth mentioned something about kind of these binaries or opposing ideas that glass holds, and I think that kind of resilience and fragility are another thing to add to that list. Beth, I was interested to hear your thoughts on fragility because working at MOA, there are some intentionally broken pieces around the bottom of your sculpture. And I'll often have people asking, oh, is that supposed to be broken? Because as a viewer, they don't quite understand maybe the intention behind that. And also we had an artist talk with Stephanie Trenchard last weekend and Jeremy Popelka. And Stephanie mentioned a moment with you working in their studio where she was blowing glass and it fell off and you just picked it up and put it back on. Like, no worries, just continue doing it. Don't let that be the end of it just because it wasn't what you thought it would be. That was kind of a beautiful moment.
It's an interesting thing to think that there's a presumed rule book to glassmaking. And many of the things we did in our shop at Tyler were outside the rule book. And we did all kinds of things that were not traditional. And that was something I encouraged a lot, to do things that were way beyond the typicality of things. And, dropping something, picking it up, saving it. It's just part of the way it goes, and I think I like hearing what Beth has allowed these other people to do because she's made it legitimate to accept things. And in my work, I oftentimes wouldn't polish a broken edge, which is a similar thing to that rule book. So many people, there has to be a fine finish there, and I thought that broken moment is another moment that talks about how the process really allowed this piece to become. Mm-hmm. And, again, I want to reiterate, I never punnied up. That's just
I love that, John, that I also think it's, because the material has so much attraction, just generally, to really accentuate these moments of danger, if something looks sharp, that it is actually sharp, it's literally sharp, that you're not creating a pedestrian experience. Right. It's the difference between something that, and I have huge respect for decorative art. I mean, I think I'm deeply inspired by the decorative arts, but I think that there's, this is the counterpoint to something that one can naturally take ownership over and have some relationship to a function with. So if something's broken and cannot hold water, or if something can cut you, or if it redefines your relationship to other in a way that is unexpected or perhaps discordant than what you were anticipating, as someone who can come in and kind of visually consume an object and understand it. If it gives you a space in which you're uncomfortable the glass does that. That material does that. And the way that you can make things in the material can really accentuate and bring to the process, bring to the foreground our like the soft body that we inhabit. And the fact that we're not, it's not always about us. It's about this other thing. And so maybe it's not about taking, categorizing, naming, consuming, and moving on. There's something sticky about it that's not, only for your benefit on some level, if that makes sense.
Sticky. I wrote down visually consume. I love that. That's beautiful. Something that I think is incredibly relevant to this conversation is the idea of mentorship. Both of you kind of naturally opened your introduction by talking about instructors and influential family members and people who allowed you to become who you are, who encouraged it, who helped it to grow. And I guess I would just like to hear from both of you a little bit about, particularly as a glass artist, a professional artist, a glass artist, the value of mentorship. Is it completely necessary? Should everyone have a mentor? And also, has that kind of shifted over time? Is it more one-on-one, or is it more being a part of the entire glass community and just kind of absorbing information from other artists in your community?
Well, I think mentorship is critical to any pursuit that we need guidance with, and that's pretty much life. It's a courageous thing to consider becoming an artist. I really believe that. It didn't seem hard at the time for me, but in retrospect, I think for me to tell my parents, factory workers, that I was going to spend my life pursuing glass and I would leave the country to go to England. Well, what I have experienced as a teacher is that it is my responsibility to help young people or old people, whoever the students are, realize that there is a way. And through resourcefulness and my role model, and to see that I have done everything from the ground up, and therefore anyone should be able to do that through example. Really, that's what, and I'm always there, and I've always been there to help students and people in general who ask for information to share it gladly.
Beth?
So I'm going to say, I'm going to repeat something that Bill Viola said in a lecture that I attended, and that which totally stuck with me. And that is that he was talking about his place within community. And he said, well, my mother taught me how to drink out of a glass. And, it begins at home. It is a fallacy to think that we are autonomous, that we are alone, that we are unencumbered. We're all, if we are able to function at all in our worlds, it is because we have been mentored by probably countless people. And I think that we have a better understanding now of our interconnectivity with others, our collective. We are eusocial beings. We do need each other. We rise and fall together, as has been seen like writ large over the last 2 years. And I try to pay it forward whenever I can. And I feel completely humble and grateful for every person that has deeply, given to me in not just my creative practice, but in my life. So, I mean, I think I am also a mother. So it's like, I realize I'm like, oh, you do have to teach someone to drink out of a cup. you have to teach that. That is not something that you're born and you know how to use a fork, and so I just think you can take it down to a very basic and elemental level of how how socialized we are. And then to think that we are within a lineage of creative beings that have been making marks for thousands of years, more than thousands of years. And to situate a practice in that way, and to think of every day that you go into the studio and you make another mark, it's a continuation of an entire mentorship of humanity, essentially,
It's a big answer. Oh gosh. Fabulous.
Yes, it is. I was thinking that your analogy to family culture, like moms and dads being the primary mentors, studios have a similar quality, like the Tyler studio over the years became something particular, as would any other studio, whether it be Kent State or Madison or River Falls. But Tyler definitely had a reputation of sort of teaching people how to eat. And I'm talking about at the table of glass, they would go in and dig in. Other schools, I believe, didn't have the same kind of veracity that we had, but that's only being somewhat egocentric, I suppose. But anyway, I'm very proud about the kind of diverse exploration that went on at Tyler. The rules were not posted. There really were no rules.
Teaching them to play with their food.
We also all really, you did foster such a strong communal aesthetic. Like we were all reliant on one another, but just the way that it was structured and held, John, the way you held those years, those experiences, that, it was not, there was space for everyone. Maybe to different extents, depending upon what the dynamic was with different people, which we talked about. But there, it was like food. You were nurtured in that environment. It was a really special. I think it was a really special department at a really significant time, and it was the first time, I think, in the history of the movement that things became kind of predominantly like female oriented, right? Like that period of time was the shift where there were more women than men sometimes in the department.
Yeah, very exciting. I think we've gone on here. Now, do you think anyone is still here, and may there be any questions?
There are people here, and there are 2 questions. If you want to shift into that. Beth, there's one question particularly for you from Taylor Roy from the Bergstrom. Beth, what was it like to work on a bathroom? How do you feel about the final piece? And did you ever imagine creating a bathroom? I imagine this is for the Kohler Art Preserve. Yeah.
Yes, I just completed an artist-made bathroom called Wild Matter for Art Preserve in Kohler, Wisconsin. And full disclosure, the moment I first saw the artist-made washrooms at the John Michael Kohler Arts Center, which was probably in 2002, 2003, I instantly started fantasizing about making a bathroom. So only 20 years worth of fantasizing about making my own artist-made washroom. And that piece in particular is like the fourth proposal, maybe third proposal for a washroom that I had submitted to Kohler over 20 years. So it was very intense and exactly what I thought it would be in terms of making. Wasn't too many surprises. But really, if you're local, yeah, I was going to say, if you're local, please visit Art Preserve in Kohler, because it is an incredible addition to our cultural landscape nationally now. Thanks for the question.
It is fabulous. The bathrooms at the John Michael Kohler Art Center and the Art Preserve are magical. And I mean, how many artists can say that they've not only dreamt about creating their own bathroom design, but actually got to fulfill that dream of having their own artist-inspired bathroom space? Another question that we have, or the last question I will say that we have before wrapping up tonight. Beth and John, did either one of you have mentors from unrelated fields to yours? If yes, what was their unique contribution to your practice? Beth, you touched on this a little bit, I think.
Yeah, I did too. Doc Bailey was a sociologist who really was one of the primary figures of my life. He was the guy that took us to Europe, helped me see beyond my horizons, and he's another person who believed in me. And, the gaining self-confidence is key to being the creative you. And there's a magic that happens when we make work where we'll be so engaged that there's a moment when it's finished and we wonder how we got there. And this is only realized when you have self-confidence to take the leap of faith, to dig in deep and find the other side.
Anything to add to that?
Hi, Atesh. I would be remiss if I did not mention Louis Knaus, who is he is actually within my field, within my fiber study background at Tyler School of Art, but he continues to be a mentor to me. I am deeply grateful to know him and to kind of have witnessed and observed his, not only his creative practice, but the way that he approaches life in general. He also is a Philadelphia-based artist who's phenomenal.
Allie, thank you.
Thank you. I want to say thank you to both of you for sharing your wisdom with us tonight, and your talent with the world, and your artwork with me and everyone at MOA. The exhibition, just a reminder, is on display through January 23rd. So you have plenty of time to go and see the Studio Glass movement in Wisconsin, the Hyde Collection at the Museum of Wisconsin Art. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone, enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks for joining. All right.